Well, hello, everybody. Salam alaikum. My name is Adam Semensky. It's my great pleasure to welcome you here in my capacity as the president of KAPSARC. I'm delighted to see so many people joining us today to explore aspects of the circular carbon economy, or CCE, concept. KAPSARC engaged with leading international organizations to write a series of reports on carbon management that form the CCE guide. The cornerstone of the guide collaboration has been that each partner has full independence and control over the content of their reports. The CCE webinar series will explore the key results of those studies. I would like to offer a most warm welcome to today's guest, Alex Zapanthis from the Global CCS Institute. Alex will be discussing the role of carbon capture and storage in the circular carbon economy. Let me just say a little bit about KAPSARC. We are an independent, nonprofit research think tank located in Saudi Arabia. Our mission is to advance the understanding of energy economics and the environment, and to act as a catalyst for dialogue on issues of importance to policymakers and the public. This year, the respected University of Pennsylvania think tank survey said that KAPSARC was in the top quartile for energy think tanks globally. For the Saudi G20 presidency, KAPSARC was selected to co-lead the think tank engagement group called the Think 20 or T20. Our vice president for research, Dr. Fahad Al-Turki, was appointed to chair the T20. And on a separate track, our work for the CCE guide was used extensively by the G20 ministers, and the CCE framework was endorsed at their September meeting. Now, a little bit about the circular carbon economy idea. Experts largely agree that the challenge of achieving our climate goals is best met by encouraging all options to manage GHG emissions. One of the organizing principles of what we call the circular economy is the 3 R's of reduce, reuse, and recycle. The circular carbon economy embraces each of these principles and adds a fourth, or remove. These 4 R's form the basis of carbon management in the circular carbon economy. Reduce the fugitive carbon, recycle and reuse carbon as a valuable resource, and remove excess carbon and store it. The CCE framework is an integrated and holistic approach to a more comprehensive, resilient, and climate-friendly energy system that supports and enables sustainable development. CCE encourages the broad development of technologies associated with managing carbon and other GHG emissions. And it seeks practical solutions that foster economic well-being and improvements in the quality of life for everyone. Now let me introduce Eric Williams. Eric is a senior research fellow at KAPSARC. He has over 20 years of experience as an energy and environmental economist, and he's focused on climate change policy, energy systems analysis, and climate change mitigation and adaptation options. Before joining KAPSARC in 2018, Eric worked as a utility commission economist and was a consultant at the OECD. He's worked at the United Nations, at academic research institutes, at think tanks, and in the government. Eric, over to you.
Thanks, Adam. I'm going to speak really briefly today about circular carbon economy. Ferris, are you able to share? There we go. Next slide. As Adam mentioned, the circular carbon economy is really an extension of the idea of the circular economy. And I think a lot of people are familiar with the idea of circular economy, so I think it's useful to look at how these are related. So as Adam mentioned, in the circular economy, you have reduce, reuse, and recycle. And then in the circular carbon economy, we add a 4th R for remove. And I'll go into a little bit more detail about those and how they fit together in a moment. In circular economy, it's really a framework for sustainable production and consumption, whereas circular carbon economy is a framework for climate mitigation that values all options. The scope of the circular economy is resource and material flows, whereas the scope of the circular carbon economy is energy and carbon flows. And the goal of the circular economy is to minimize resource consumption and waste disposal, whereas the goal of the circular carbon economy is to manage greenhouse gas emissions, including CO2, toward a balance or a net zero. Next slide. So this is a very stylized representation of the circular carbon economy. And in the middle there, you see the circular economy of material flows and products. And driving that circular economy is energy efficiency and energy at the bottom. Reduce part of circular carbon economy is nuclear renewables and energy efficiency because they reduce the amount of CO2 that needs to be managed. Then if you look at the top and toward the right, photosynthesis and natural sinks already recycle carbon, and we can take advantage of that through bioenergy, which feeds back into circular economy. We can also capture CO2 directly from point sources, or we can capture it through direct air capture. And that's really the topic for today, and that's remove. And so we remove the CO2 and we can store it in geologic storage, or we could even take that CO2 that we've captured and reuse it in products or fuels that feed back into the circular economy. And I'd invite you to check out the CCE guide at www.cceguide.org, which has a series of reports that cover this in much more detail, as well as some other useful resources. And so with that, I would like to pass it over to Alex.
Well, thank you very much, Eric. I'm Alex Apantis. I'm the General Manager Commercial at the Global Carbon Capture and Storage Institute. I'll just share my screen so you can look at my slides rather than me. So hopefully in a second you'll see a title slide. Are you seeing that, Adam?
I can't see it, Alex, and you should give me or Eric a chance to say a few nice words about you. We certainly
always happy. Always happy to have nice words said about me.
We really appreciate the great work that the Global CCS Institute did on carbon capture and storage as part of the CCE guide. Alex joined the Global CCS Institute in 2016. He's accountable for managing the Institute's consultancy services and thought leadership research. He's a physicist who he claims he lost his way as he was getting an MBA. The first 12 years of his career were in government and the university sector. He was focused on radiation management, safety, and nuclear policy. Alex, I hope you had a chance to tune in a couple of days ago when we did the nuclear power portion of the circular carbon economy. He's been very involved in environmental regulation and policy. He has worked as an Australian government employee. He was assistant secretary in the environment department, and he worked in industry with Rio Tinto, one of the big resource companies in Australia. Alex clearly has seen carbon capture and storage activities from all sides as an NGO, in government, and in industry. So Alex, we're delighted that you could join us today and looking forward to your talk. Thanks very much.
Thank you once again, Adam. So very briefly, the Global Carbon Capture and Storage Institute is a think tank. We have about 70 members. We're headquartered in Melbourne and with offices in Tokyo, Beijing, Washington, DC, and London. And our mission is to accelerate the deployment of carbon capture and storage for climate mitigation purposes. So that's a very brief description of the organization that I currently work for. So I'm going to spend the next 15 minutes or so, maybe 17 minutes, describing very briefly some work that we did as part of this CCE guide that was sponsored by KAPSARC. Very quickly, Eric and Adam, of course, have already done an excellent job of taking you through the definition of what the circular carbon economy is. In summary, it's a framework, a holistic framework that encourages the selection of all options in order to mitigate climate change. And CCS, which is the part of the circular carbon economy, is just one of many options that are necessary. I'll be talking about that particular element, and that exists within the remove part of the CCE framework, because CCS removes CO2 either at the source where it's produced or directly from the atmosphere through direct air capture and geological storage. So carbon capture and storage facilities exist today. This slide shows the distribution by time and also by industry of the application of large-scale, commercial-scale carbon capture and storage facilities that are operating. In fact, there are more than this. This slide is a year old, and we'll be updating this slide for our next status report, which is being released in the first week of December. There are more than this, but the point I'd like to make here, just on this slide very quickly, is that CCS can be applied to a range of industries. Effectively, any industry which is a point source of carbon dioxide, you can apply carbon capture and storage to. It's actually a suite of technologies. It's also not new. CCS commenced in 1972. Now, at that time, it was being done for the purpose, really, probably entirely for enhanced oil recovery. But enhanced oil recovery actually results in the permanent storage of the carbon dioxide, which is used to produce that oil. The first storage activity that was conducted for the purposes of climate mitigation and for no other purpose was commenced in 1996 at Sleipner. And that particular facility has been injecting about 1 million tonnes of carbon dioxide into the subsea floor in the North Sea, offshore Norway, since 1996. So it's not a new technology. It's actually a very well-established technology. It's been operating for nearly 50 years since 1996 for pure storage purposes. You'll note from this slide also that there's only a couple of operating facilities which are in the power sector, Boundary Dam and Petra Nova. And in fact, Petra Nova is mothballed for the moment while the oil price is so low because running it doesn't make commercial sense. And the reason for that is because it's simply more expensive to capture from power sources because the concentration of CO2 is lower. Of course, at the other end of the spectrum, capturing CO2 from natural gas processing, for example, or fertilizer production, or anything which involves the gasification of coal in particular, is very low cost because the CO2 is presented to you at a very high concentration. So your capture costs are extremely low in that case. Still have transport and storage costs, of course. So that's quite a nice segue into the next slide, which attempts to break down the CCS value chain into its components and show how each component of that value chain contributes to the total cost of carbon capture and storage. The first column on the left, I guess, with CO2 capture underneath it, are the indicative capture costs for different sources of carbon dioxide. So the most expensive options are options which have a very low concentration of CO2. And if you ignore atmospheric CO2 for the moment, the most expensive option is where it involves the combustion of natural gas because the concentration of CO2 is low, it's only about 4%. And the cost of capture alone from natural gas power would be around $70 to $75 per tonne. All of these costs assume construction on Gulf Coast USA. And these costs will always be site specific. So these are indicative costs for one location. They don't necessarily apply everywhere. In fact, they don't apply everywhere. At the other end of the spectrum, of course, you've got those near pure or pure sources of carbon dioxide. For example, natural gas processing, anything that involves gasification of coal, anything from fermentation of biofuels, for example, where your capture costs are approaching zero because you've got a pure or near pure source of carbon dioxide. After you've got the CO2, you need to compress it. Because the CO2 needs to be injected in a supercritical state. So that means compressing it to at least 74 times atmospheric pressure. And in fact, what's typical is compressing it to about 150 times atmospheric pressure to account for pressure losses as you transport it in pipelines. Then you need to transport it. The mature option for transporting CO2 is in pipelines. There are about 5,000 miles, I think, of CO2 transport pipelines in the United States that operate today. But shipping is starting to be examined as an option for offshore storage. And of course, after you've transported your CO2 to the injection location, you need to actually inject it. And there are some costs associated with that, but they tend to be quite low. So the point I'd like to make from this slide is that how much does CCS cost? Well, it depends. It depends on where you are. It depends on scale, which is something I might have a bit of time to talk about later. and it depends upon your capture source. But one thing which is for certain, the lowest cost opportunities for CCS today are certainly less than $20 a tonne, $20 per tonne for the whole value chain. So that's for the capture, the transport, and the storage of that carbon dioxide. And these are opportunities that can deliver multi-million tonne abatements in one location at one facility. So there has been a lot of renewed interest, I guess, around carbon capture and storage in the last few years. I've been working around climate change and CCS specifically for 14 years, something like that. The enthusiasm and the attention that CCS is now starting to produce is something that we haven't seen for a decade. It really started in about 2017, as you can see from this slide. So what this slide shows is the CCS project pipeline. The blue bars are facilities that are actually operating, and then the other coloured bars are in various stages of either construction or development. So why is this so? Why is there such a sustained year-on-year growth in the CCS project pipeline? And by the way, this slide is dated. This is dated May. When we update this for our status report, the 2020 bar will be taller again. Well, I think there's a couple of reasons for this. Number one, there's a growing recognition of the urgency of climate action. Net zero has become the language of climate change now. We're no longer talking about deep emissions reductions, we're talking about net zero. And when the analysis is done to identify how to actually achieve net zero in any economy, the answer is always the same. The answer is always, you need absolutely every option, bar none. You can leave no options off the table. If you don't have every tool available to you, you simply can't get there. And that is reflected quite nicely in the International Panel on Climate Change 2018, I think it was, late 2018 report, their 1.5 degrees Celsius report. What this report did is it looked at 90 different models or scenarios. Each one of these models or scenarios did resolve and did solve for a 1.5 degrees Celsius outcome. It then identified from those 90 scenarios 4 illustrative pathways which sought to illustrate the range of possible pathways towards stabilization at 1.5 degrees. So there are 4 illustrative pathways. 3 of those 4 illustrative pathways required CCS at significant scale, so between 350 odd to over 1,200 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide stored this century in order to deliver a 1.5 degrees Celsius outcome. The 4th illustrative pathway did not require CCS, but it could only solve for 1.5 degrees if final energy demand reduced by about a third by 2050 compared to 2010, which is, I think that's not feasible. Everything is actually going in the other direction. Energy demand is growing, has been growing. All the fundamental drivers are for growth in energy demand, not for significant reductions. In fact, if you look at the average mass of CO2 which is required to be stored in the year 2050, so not cumulatively up to, but in the year 2050, across all of those models, the answer is about a bit over 10 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide. So there's no doubt that CCS, alongside everything else, to be clear, I'm not talking about a silver bullet here, you need everything, but CCS alongside everything else is absolutely essential to maximize the probability of stabilizing the global climate. So precisely where does CCS get applied? Well, CCS obviously has a very important role in industry. On the left-hand side of this slide, you can see direct carbon dioxide emissions in 2017, and you can see that about 8 billion tonnes, roughly, of those direct carbon dioxide emissions are from industry, and those industries are identified in the browny orangey coloured bar to the right of that box. About 2 billion tonnes of CO2 emissions from those industries are process emissions. So these are emissions which are the products of chemical reactions. So for example, when you make cement, you need to turn calcium carbonate into calcium oxide, and the result is the emission of carbon dioxide. There is simply no way to avoid that emission unless you adopt a completely new process for the production of cement, which of course is an option. It's an option for all of these industries, but commercially and technically feasible, they're not, generally speaking. The International Energy Agency did an analysis last year where they estimated the amount of CO2 which needed to be captured and stored from industry between 2017 and 2060 in order to deliver a climate outcome which is consistent with the Paris Agreement, so that's less than 2 degrees. And what they found is that you needed about 29 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide to be captured and stored from industry, with the lion's share of that coming from what's broadly called the chemicals industry, because many chemical processes produce very high concentration, high purity CO2 streams, which are therefore have a low cost of capture. So CCS industry is, I think now, very well accepted and is not controversial in many ways. CCS will also need to play a role in power. Now, this is more controversial, of course, because what we tend to bump up against here, unfortunately, is this destructive, polarized, simplistic debate, which says it's fossil fuels versus renewables versus nuclear. That's unhelpful. As I mentioned earlier, and as all the modeling showed, everything is required. So what I've done on this slide, and this is actually summarized in the report that we produced for KAPSARC, is a bit of a thought experiment. The left-hand side, what I've pulled out there are the assumed reduction in the utilization of coal, or the primary energy produced from coal, for each of those pathways which achieve a 1.5 degree Celsius outcome. And you can see that in order to solve those models on average, those pathways required coal utilization to reduce by about between 60 and 80% roughly, by 2030 compared to 2010. So that's what the models say is required in order to achieve 1.5. The right-hand side of this slide shows what's actually happening. So right now there's roughly 2,000 gigawatts of installed capacity, coal capacity. There's over 500 gigawatts of new capacity, which is expected to come online before 2030. Now, not all of that will come online. Some of those projects won't proceed, but there's 200 gigawatts, over 200 gigawatts of new capacity, which is already in construction. And you would assume that the vast majority of that will actually come online. These plants are all long-lived, high capital assets. They have economic lives of 40 or 50 years. So if you consider only the plants that are either operating today or under construction, so ignore the other 300 of the 500, and you take into account the expected retirements, because much of the current fleet is aged and will retire in coming years. But then you assume that they operate at a lower capacity factor than they would otherwise operate at, and you assume more early retirements than would be the case absent any additional policy to what exists today. What you find is that, and if all of that results in the emissions from that fleet of only half what you would expect absent any increase in climate policy, what you find is you need to capture 85 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide from that fleet between 2030 and 2050 in order to be consistent with a 1.5 degree Celsius outcome. You could do a similar analysis. I could do a similar analysis for gas-fired power generation. I've just used coal because it's I had less uncertainty in the numbers around coal. So the message is very clear. You need to throw CCS at industry, and you need to throw CCS at power, particularly in Asia, where fossil power is growing and growing quite strongly. Hydrogen is another very strong driver of interest in carbon capture and storage. So the Hydrogen Council published a report in 2017 where they essentially identified the size of the prize, and their conclusion was clean hydrogen demand could be in excess of 500 million tonnes of hydrogen per year in the middle of this century. And if that was the case, it could deliver upwards of 6 billion tonnes of abatement, CO2 abatement. Of course, that only applies if the hydrogen that is produced is clean. So not produced from gas or coal as it is today without carbon capture and storage. So today there's about 70 million tonnes of pure hydrogen produced per year, and there's about another 50 million tonnes or thereabouts of hydrogen produced mixed with other gases, mostly in syngas. So the scale up challenge here is critical. We need to go from, call it 100 million tonnes per year production today to 500 million tonnes production by the middle of this century. Now, the good news is that hydrogen production from fossil fuels with carbon capture and storage has been operating since 1982 in the United States. It's not new technology, it's off the shelf, it's very well established, it's essentially no technical risk. And these plants operate at significant scale, at material scale. So the largest plant that you can see here is actually from coal gasification. It produces 1,300 tonnes of clean hydrogen per day. And it started operating with CCS in the year 2000, been operating for 20 years. The smallest one of these plants is 100 tonnes of hydrogen per day. That's under construction. The other 7 are actually operating. So fossil fuel hydrogen with CCS, which is low emissions, is available right now, has already been operating for 40 odd years, and can scale up quite rapidly because these technologies are well established, they're mature, they're familiar, that there's no uncertainty really around their deployment. And happily right now, at least, and I think at least for in almost every part of the world for at least a decade or two to come, production of clean hydrogen from fossil fuels with CCS is a third to a half the cost of production of clean hydrogen from using electricity, using zero emissions electricity, renewables or nuclear, for example, with electrolysis. So it's available at scale now. It's cheaper now, and to be frank, we can't wait. We need to be getting on with the job of mitigating climate change, not wait. The other advantage that CCS with fossil fuels to produce hydrogen has is that it incurs no abatement opportunity cost. So what do I mean by that? Well, that's on the right-hand side of this chart. The short, I don't have time to go into detail here, but in summary, you get the most abatement, emissions abatement from renewable power or nuclear power, or any zero emissions power, if you use that electricity in the grid to displace unabated fossil generation. If you use that same quantity of renewable power to produce hydrogen, which then displaces the combustion of natural gas, you will get only a third of the abatement that you would get if that renewable power was instead displacing combined cycle gas in the grid, and you will get less than an eighth of the abatement that you would get if that renewable power was instead used to displace, say, German lignite production. So in terms of a holistic, lowest cost, biggest bang for your buck approach to emissions abatement, if there's a grid anywhere nearby your renewable energy resource, that's where you should be using your renewable power, because that's where you'll get the most emissions abatement. You should not be using it to produce hydrogen. Whoops, I just skipped one accidentally there. A quick word on direct air capture. So direct air capture is very important for one reason. And the reason for that is that it offers the opportunity to cap your total mitigation cost. Now, it's certainly more expensive than many mitigation options, and it's certainly more expensive than capturing CO2 from a high concentration point source. But it's certainly a lot less expensive at the far end, at the far right end of your marginal abatement cost curve than other options in hard to abate sectors. So what direct air capture offers is the opportunity to cap that cost. Right now, it's probably costing of the order of $800 a tonne to capture CO2 directly from the atmosphere. However, simply by scaling the technologies up from the current scale, which is thousands of tonnes per year, to multi-millions of tonnes per year, the expectation is that the cost will come down to $200, $300, $400 dollars per tonne of CO2. And at that cost, it really does, it really is offers a significant opportunity to reduce the cost of abating those hard to abate sectors, or in fact some sectors where there are no feasible options right now to reduce emissions. The other advantage that direct air capture has, of course, is that you can put it anywhere. You don't need to site it next to your CO2 source. Not quite anywhere. You need to have good storage as well. All right, so I've made a pretty strong case for CCS, but clearly it's still not being deployed anywhere near as rapidly as it needs to be deployed in order to meet the climate challenge. And to be frank, it's in good company because pretty much nothing is. And the reason for that is very simple. It's that at the moment, the policy settings are such that CCS is simply, generally speaking, with some exceptions, not profitable. The bottom line is that unless CCS is profitable, private sector capital will not flow into CCS, and the same goes for any industry. There's nothing special about CCS here. So the answer is clearly policy, and I'm sure there's nothing surprising in that statement to anyone who's listening into this webinar. Our report makes 7 high-level recommendations that we think will help to overcome those commercial barriers and incentivize that private sector investment. You know, we're talking about many billions, trillions of dollars necessary to deploy at scale. The first is to do the analysis. You know, each country needs to do the analysis to define the role of every technology in its net zero pathway, including CCS, and need to communicate that to the public and to industry in a similar way to what the United Kingdom Climate Change Committee did a couple of years ago. They did the analysis, they charted the way to achieve net zero emissions for the United Kingdom, and unsurprisingly, they identified that they needed absolutely everything, including the kitchen sink, and CCS was one of those tools that was required to do the analysis, do the rigorous analysis, and communicate that to the public and to industry. Create a bankable value on the storage of carbon dioxide. This goes to the point I made at the outset. Unless it's profitable, it's not going to happen. So somehow doing CCS must create value for the investor, whether that's some sort of reward, financial reward, or the avoidance of a tax. There needs to be some sort of value, bankable long-term and sufficiently high value on storage of carbon dioxide to drive that investment, drive that behavior. There's a big role here for government in supporting the identification and appraisal of geological resources. So identifying storage resources is very, very similar to exploring for oil or gas. It's the same skill set, it's very similar processes, in fact, the same processes to a very significant extent, but without the expectation of commercial return. So once again, private sector is not going to invest in that if there's no expectation of return. And we think at least that the best way to overcome that barrier is for government to do some of the early work, or to support that early work to identify and characterize, appraise those storage resources. Regulation needs to be transparent, predictable. I mean, that applies to any large scale investment. It goes to tenure over pore space. How do I access the pore space? How do I know I can keep using that pore space for the life of my project? What are my operational requirements? What's my compliance requirements? How much is that going to cost me? And there needs to be a commercially acceptable regime in place for the management of long-term liability of stored carbon dioxide. Now, the risk of leakage in a properly selected storage resource is very, very close to zero, extremely close to zero, but it's not zero. The risk of anything is not zero. So there needs to be a commercially acceptable management regime for that long-term liability. CCS hubs, where you have multiple sources, all accessing common user infrastructure, offers enormous economies of scale, which reduces costs. So facilitating hubs is one area where governments can bring down the cost of CCS without having to actually stump up much of that money themselves. In fact, that's what we're seeing globally. Pretty much every project that's entered the pipeline over the past several years has been attached to a hub or cluster of one sort or another. The economics simply drives that outcome. Reduce the cost of capital. So governments can offer concessional finance. Mind you, money's so cheap at the moment, there's probably less opportunity for government to reduce the cost even further, but still, every little bit helps. You know, the difference between a high risk lending rate and a low risk lending rate can add easily tens of millions of dollars to the cost of servicing debt for a CCS project. And finally, where required, you know, provide some capital support to kick the industry off. You know, we know how to do this. This has been done in many other industries, whether it be telecommunications, internet, road, rail, electricity generation, distribution. Often it's been government that has been the first investor until such time as the business becomes secure and profitable, and then the private sector comes in. So I think I'll end it there. I've probably gone over time. I'm sorry, Adam and Eric, but happy to have any questions.
Alex, thank you very much. Ferris, could you go to slide 5? There were a number of questions about slide 5. What was driving the decline in prospective projects in the middle?
Yep.
Could you explain a little bit about the shape there? And
yep.
And are the costs here OPEX, CAPEX, or both?
Okay, so these aren't costs. On the y-axis, you have the capacity of the CCS projects that make up the pipeline. So in 2010, the total capacity in million tonnes per annum of CO2 stored from all of the projects was 160 million tonnes, and it dropped down to a low in 2017 of 65 odd million tonnes, and increased in May 2020 to 120, 130, and it's more than that now. So what's driven this? So I have done a bit of investigation to understand that trend. I think what happened was about a decade or more ago, the expectation of costs of CCS were unreasonably low. Just a reality. No one had actually built one attached to industrial sources that had a high cost of capture. Assumptions were made that were unrealistic. And when the studies were done, what was discovered was that the actual costs were higher. Now, the costs that were believed to be the case a decade ago are now the case now, right? The costs have come down to that level. But back then, the costs were much higher than expected. The other complicating factor about a decade or more ago is the global financial crisis. So what you'll notice here is that the projects in development started dropping off much more than the projects in operation. In fact, the operating projects, the blue bar, grows every year. But those that were in development, advanced development, were not proceeding through to FID. And I mean, it's a bit hard to unscramble this egg, but I think a big factor in that would have been the private sector and the public sector focusing on recovery from the global financial crisis, you know, money being hard to find, capital being hard to find. So that, I think, has driven the decline. You get to about 2015 and we have the Paris Agreement. And, you know, the Paris Agreement was criticized quite a bit at the time, but in fact, what it did is for the very first time, it articulated a global agreement in terms of an ambition. And since the Paris Agreement, the recognition for the need for urgent climate action has ramped up. As I said earlier, the language has gone from deep emissions reduction to net zero. I don't think there's a large company on the earth today that doesn't discuss the risks and opportunities associated with climate change in the boardroom. It's much higher on the risk register than it has been in the past. And this has driven all sorts of activity around identifying ways to reduce emissions. And of course, if you're a company or a nation that has a high CO2 footprint, CCS emerges as one of the technologies which is necessary to manage that CO2 footprint. So that's my hypothesis as to why that curve looks like that.
Thanks,
and
Alex.
Policy has changed a lot in the last couple of years, which is bringing more private capital in as well.
Thank you. There was a correction. The costs, the question on OPEX, CAPEX was on slide 4. Ferris, could you go back one slide?
I can do that.
Yeah. There we go.
Yeah, so these are a combination of OPEX and CAPEX. So this is variable and fixed operating and paying off your capital as well, assuming 6% cost of capital. So it's the cost per tonne. So in other words, what this is saying is, to use my example of $20 per tonne, if you were paid $20 a tonne, you would have an NPV 0 project at a 6% hurdle rate. So it's OPEX and it's CAPEX, it's total cost. Does that answer that question?
I think it does. Alex, you touched on risks. Could you just kind of tell us what the long-term risks are, hazards associated with long-term storage of CO2?
So the risks that are often raised are obviously the risk of leakage. Will the CO2 stay where you put it? Another risk which is often raised is the risk of induced seismicity. I think they're probably the two major risks, and I'll address them each separately. And if my geologist is watching, he's probably going to be pulling his hair out of my inept description. But so we store CO2 as a supercritical fluid at depths of at least 800 meters, and typically it's more than 1 kilometer, 2 kilometers, 3 kilometers down. In porous rock, which is generally filled with saline water and is covered by a layer of impermeable rock. If you choose the right geological structure in which to store your CO2, which of course we will and we do and we have, the risk of that CO2 making it out of that structure and finding its way to the atmosphere is extremely low. So think of it this way, the reason why we're able to produce oil and gas today is because that oil and gas has been held in the subsurface for millions of years, literally millions of years. And what CCS is doing, in essence, is identifying structures which are identical, in many cases, to those which have held that oil and gas for millions of years, and reversing the process. We're putting that carbon back into the ground from which it came originally. So the risk of leakage is very, very, very low. In fact, the only real credible risk is if you have unknown wells, bores that have been drilled that aren't properly closed. Having said that, if that was the case, you'd identify them and seal them off. So the risk of leakage is extremely low, and there's never been leakage, at least that we're aware of, from any of the operating CCS facilities, despite over 260 million tonnes of anthropogenic CO2 having been injected to date. Microseismicity. So CCS, injection of fluids into the subsurface, can induce microseismicity. So these are very small seismic events that you can measure using sensitive equipment, but you can't feel. The thing about CCS is that you're deliberately storing your CO2, injecting your CO2 at a pressure which is below the fracture pressure of the reservoir. So the last thing you want to do is frack. So CCS is not fracking. In fact, it's the opposite of fracking in some ways. And of course, you inject it at a pressure which is below that fracture pressure with a margin of safety, and the monitoring allows you to do that with great precision. A related risk, of course, is what about earthquakes? Can they cause leakage? Well, theoretically, I guess possibly it can, but in reality, once again, the risk is infinitesimally low. And we actually have examples where there have been earthquakes very close to CO2 storage sites, in Japan in particular, near the Tomokamai demonstration facility. That particular facility has very advanced monitoring equipment on the seafloor. It's a subsea floor storage facility, but very close to the shore, and the injection site's actually onshore. And throughout various earthquake events which have occurred in that region, there's been absolutely no mobilization of that CO2 away from the storage location.
Alex, a quick follow-up question on that. I think that the experience with Occidental Petroleum and Saudi Aramco is that enhanced oil recovery injection of CO2, that most of the CO2 has been retained in the reservoir. And I know that other CO2 storage projects seem to involve some mineralization of the CO2, which would then reduce leakage. Could you just touch on that briefly?
Yeah, so when you inject CO2 into any geological structure, there are a number of processes that all start, and they all start from the second you inject it, although at different rates. The last one that occurs generally, or the one that takes the longest to become significant, is mineralization, where you have the CO2 reacting with rocks and other minerals in that storage resource and actually precipitating out as a solid. So that's what mineralization is generally. However, there's also much faster opportunities to achieve mineralization if you inject your carbon dioxide into what are called basaltic formations. So these are formations which have lots of basalt rock. It's just the nature of the chemistry of those formations that results in mineralization of carbon dioxide in a period of, I think it's days or weeks. It's incredibly short. And in fact, there's a project in Iceland which is doing precisely that. In fact, they are using direct air capture to capture carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and then injecting it into these basaltic formations, which is resulting in the mineralization of that CO2 in an extremely short time. And of course, once it's mineralized, the solid, it's never, ever going anywhere.
Thank you. Eric, did you have any questions?
Yeah, so you mentioned before in the presentation about CO2 hubs, and I know that Norway and the UK have or are in the process of developing a CO2 hub. Are there any other countries or locations where those are in development or that you think would be particularly good locations where they might be considered to be developed?
Absolutely, Eric. So in fact, I put up one of my backup slides that, once again, this slide's about a year old, so it's out of date. There's more than this, but each of those locations on that map shows a location where a CCS hub is either operating or in development. Essentially, what you need for a hub to be successful.
Were you going to show the slide, or?
Oh, can you not see it? Sorry.
No.
Let me share my screen. I thought I was still sharing my screen. Share. Okay. Are you seeing that now?
I can see it.
Yep. Okay. So as I was saying, this map shows the location of hubs that are either operating or planned in development, subject to studies around the world. But this slide is about a year old. It's actually out of date. There are more hubs that we need to add to this slide, and we'll add to this slide when we update it. So you know, for example, we just had a look at opportunities here in Australia, and there's at least another 4 significant hub opportunities just in Australia. So all you need for a hub to be successful is a good storage resource, and there's no shortage of good storage resources, and relatively proximate. And by relatively proximate, I'm saying, you know, within 400 or 500 kilometres, a collection of industrial sources that have CO2 emissions. And in fact, what you find, if you look at industry generally, is industry typically does tend to develop in precincts because of the existence of factors of production. So right now, there are many communities and around the world which have rely upon a collection of industries, many of which are high emissions industries, for their economic well-being. And what CCS hubs and clusters offer is the opportunity to decarbonise those industries through the application of carbon capture and storage, where there's a nearby appropriate storage resource. And as you can see, there are many opportunities for that.
Alex, while you have this slide up, one of the questions was relating to, at least in the US, a study that was done one time that said there would have to be a huge pipeline network to move CO2 from its sources to where it could be stored. One of the interesting things in Saudi Arabia is that direct air capture could be, you know, or even in the United States, I suppose, direct air capture could be placed right on top of the storage facility, so you wouldn't need pipeline networks. But could you comment on the pipeline network question?
Yeah, so pipelines are a very mature technology. As I mentioned, there's about 5,000 miles or more of dedicated carbon dioxide transport pipelines operating right now in the United States of America. Pretty much every CCS facility that's operating or planned will use or does use a CO2 pipeline. The CO2 is typically transported between, you know, low tens of kilometers to, in some cases, hundreds of kilometers from the source to the storage facility. So there's nothing new or particularly challenging about pipelines from an operation or operability or technology perspective. In terms of the scale of pipelines that are required, if we are going to meet climate targets, which will require large CO2 deployment, yes, we're going to need significant CO2 transport and storage pipeline and infrastructure. But we already have that, for example, for the transport of natural gas. So once again, there's nothing technically difficult or challenging about pipelines in itself. You just need the business case to make the investment. So for natural gas and oil and other products, ethane and various other hydrocarbons that are transported literally thousands of kilometres by pipelines, that business case exists, the investment has been made, and those pipelines exist and are operating today. If the business case for transporting CO2 similarly existed, exactly the same thing would happen, and you would have a rapid growth in the infrastructure to transport carbon dioxide.
Thank you, Alex. There was another question, and I might take this one. It was along the lines of, what about dealing with CO2 recycling, conversion into chemicals, photosynthesis, and so on. That gives me an opportunity to advertise that we'll be having another CCE webinar, and Irina, which has done some work on the bio cycles involved in CO2, will be talking about that option. And the International Energy Agency, which did some work for the CCE guide on CO2 use and conversion into chemicals, will be talking about that in one of our other webinars. So that's not really today's subject, but I'm delighted to tell you that we're trying to look at this holistically, and we are trying to look at the opportunity set and the options for all of the 4 R's, again: reduce, reuse, recycle, and remove. I'm now looking, Eric, back to you maybe for another question, and then I'll check what's here on the screen, and then we'll wrap it up so that we're done before the top of the hour.
Sure. So, Alex, you had, I think, made the case pretty convincing case that the technology is well established and mature, and has been around in some way or another for almost 50 years, and that really the barrier is the business case. So if you could have, I don't know, the top 3 things that governments could do to facilitate making that business case, what would you say that those are?
I think the top 3 would be, number 1, do the analysis, identify and understand very clearly the role of CCS alongside everything else in your particular jurisdiction. The next would be actively facilitate the creation of hubs and clusters, because the economies of scale that you achieve through going from your typical CCS facility, which is operating today, which is only storing about 1 million tons of carbon dioxide a year, to a hub or a cluster that can store 15 or 20 million tons per year. That delivers very significant cost savings in your cost of transport and storage. So facilitate the establishment of those hubs and clusters, and that will involve a number of things. That will involve assisting with appraisal of storage resources. That will involve provision of low-cost capital. I suspect that will involve perhaps being the first investor in that infrastructure in order to enable private sector investment. And the third thing I would say that governments need to do is to create some sort of mechanism to reward the storage of carbon dioxide. So a really good example of that actually is in the United States, where the tax credit, which is offered under Section 45Q of their Internal Revenue Code, pays up to $50 US a ton for each ton of carbon dioxide which is stored, 35 if it's used for enhanced oil recovery. So that's driven enormous growth in the project pipeline in the United States, because suddenly there's a significant financial reward for putting your CO2 into the ground instead of emitting it to the atmosphere. And the private sector is doing exactly what the private sector does. It sees an opportunity for a profitable investment. It makes the investment. So as a consequence, most of the facilities that operate today are actually, well, not most. The US has more facilities than anywhere else operating, and certainly most of the new facilities that have entered the pipeline recently. Last year we added about 10, I think, from memory. I think 8 of that 10 were in the United States, and that is a direct consequence of that tax credit being extended and the value of that tax credit being increased.
Thank you, Alex. There was one question about your map that doesn't show. It shows little hub activity in Africa, and is there a reason for that? Let me just take a quick stab. I think Africa's problem, even along with much of Latin America and parts of Asia, is access to energy, and not so much the need to store the CO2 from combusting the hydrocarbons. Certainly flaring activities, that's a greenhouse gas issue. It's not really so much of a remove issue, but it's one that could certainly be addressed in a lot of different areas. And I don't really see why, if ultimately the business case can be made for CO2 storage, why places like Africa and other nations that have the geologic and areas, regions and continents that have geologic storage, it wouldn't be suitable. I think, Eric, we're going to try to get everybody out of here on time. Alex, I'd like to thank you very much for the great talk today. There are a few other questions that we didn't get to. One was political opposition to CCS. You know, I think part of that is just skepticism that this is just a way that industry offers as in an effort to keep using hydrocarbons. I think hydrocarbons are going to be with us for a long time. Most of the long-term studies show that. And I think it's up to governments and companies to create the frameworks in regulation and financing to make carbon capture and storage a reality. And then I think that the public opposition issues, if everybody takes climate as seriously as they should, would be overcome. Alex, again, I want to thank you. If there are other questions that we've missed here, we'll collect those. We'll give Alex an opportunity to try to address that. We'll find a way to do it. On behalf of KAPSARC and the Global CCS Institute, I'd like to thank everybody for participating today, and we look forward to you tuning in for the other circular carbon economy webinars that we'll be hosting over the next few weeks. Thank you, everybody, and have a good rest of your day. Bye.